Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. The greatest outdoor show on Earth kicked off in Calgary with an astronaut leading the way during the legendary Calgary Stampede Parade. Tory leader Pierre Poilievre and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sparred at the House of Commons today, taking shots at each other over the rising cost of living. And the former vice chair of the CRTC discusses the potential damage of the federal government's new Bill C-18.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. An event known as the greatest outdoor show on Earth kicked off in Calgary today. The Calgary Stampede began with its legendary Stampede Parade. Jeremy Hansen became the second astronaut to be honorary parade marshal for the event. Hansen said he sought advice from another astronaut, Chris Hadfield, who had the honor about 10 years ago.
It's actually my first time at the Stampede, not in Calgary, but at the Stampede, and to be doing it as a parade marshal, I'm pretty honored. This is pretty special for me. So I have an amazing team of folks behind me at the Canadian Space Agency, and somehow a connection was made and the invitation was extended, and I was absolutely 100%. I would love to do that. Yeah, I did reach out to Chris Hadfield, though, just to get some advice since he was the parade marshal in 2013, and he said two things: make sure you ride your horse in advance and watch out for the fireworks.
Tens of thousands of people came out and lined the streets of downtown Calgary, taking in the Calgary Stampede Parade today. There were lots of floats, classic cars, entertainers, plenty of horses, along with cowboys and cowgirls. The Stampede runs now until July 16th, featuring a midway, lots of games, food, concerts, and of course the legendary rodeo, which features a number of events including bull riding, saddle bronc, bareback, team roping, steer wrestling, and barrel racing. The rodeo runs daily at 1:30 p.m. with cowboys and cowgirls competing from all over the world. And the total prize money for the rodeo this year is $1.85 million. Those living with disabilities related to their vision will be receiving some much-needed help here in our province. The Alberta government announced that a $1 million grant will be going to the Canadian National Institute for the Blind to help remove employment barriers and ensure more visually impaired Albertans can find jobs. Government officials say the CNIB's Come to Work program already serves around 200 Albertans, but this new funding will help another 110 clients. The financial boost will be spread over the next 2 years and will be available online or in person in both Calgary and Edmonton. Thousands of firefighters continue to battle wildfires in both the central and northern parts of the province. Alberta Wildfire says there are still 108 wildfires burning in Alberta, with 14 being out of control. Fortunately, 38 are being held. There are more than 2,500 Albertans evacuated. So far this wildfire season, we have seen 814 wildfires. Fire advisories continue this weekend for a number of regions here in the province, including Lethbridge, Banff National Park, Athabasca County, Fort McMurray, Strathcona, and Leduc counties. Emergency officials in British Columbia say they've been dealing with 122 wildfires, including the Donny Creek wildfire, which is burning in the northeastern part of the province. BC Wildfire Service says the blaze is now larger than the size of Prince Edward Island and covers over 5,700 square kilometers with a perimeter of 800 kilometers. Officials believe the wildfire was started by lightning back on May the 12th. The Donny Creek wildfire is the largest ever recorded in British Columbia and is expected to burn through the fall and into the winter. It is located around 158 kilometers north of Fort St. John and is burning traditional territories of the Blueberry River First Nations, Doig First Nation, and Prophet River First Nation. Meanwhile, south of the border, a number of young black students are learning how to become firefighters. Many in Alabama are learning how to fight wildfires in the thick, dense forests.
People of color are underrepresented in the forestry industry across the board. So, we cross barriers of negative public perception about what forestry and fire really is. So our HBCU partnership has yielded a 66% increase in diversity in African Americans in forestry in the USDA Forest Service.
It's amazing seeing people who look like you, people who you are comfortable around, who understand you and all that. It makes you more willing to go out there. If you hit like a road stop or an obstacle, you have someone on your left who's probably been through it, who can help you go through it in a way where you don't have to deal with so much that maybe they had to deal with.
Being next to people that look like me, it's a huge sort of booster because they were probably once in my same situation. So if something happens, I know that I can always look up to those who have been in my position before.
That is so great to see. Well, it appears that a hot weekend is shaping up right here in southwestern Alberta. Angela Stewart is in now with a quick peek at the forecast. Angela, if someone is thinking of maybe taking a canoe out in the lake this weekend, it may not be a bad time to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not shaping up too bad this weekend. We might see an afternoon thunderstorm tomorrow, but that's about it for the remainder of the weekend. It's going to be fairly nice all around. Like I mentioned there, risk of an afternoon thunderstorm tomorrow, but as for tonight, there is also a risk of a thunderstorm, about a 30% chance, expected to sit at a low of 10 tonight, shooting up to 31 degrees tomorrow for Saturday, and then sitting at a low of 12. As for how the rest of the week is shaping up, I'll have all those details coming up later in the show.
Great. Thanks so much, Angela. Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre blasted Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the House of Commons today. Poilievre says the PM gave Canadians a sucker punch when it came to helping to contribute to rising mortgage rates.
And interest rates are now 19 times higher than they were a year ago. Wow. The Governor of the Bank of Canada, the former Liberal Finance Minister, countless other experts agree that the Prime Minister's deficits are ballooning inflation and therefore interest rates. Families have to plan their finances. So will he indicate how much will the average family see their monthly mortgage payments go up over the next 3 years? How much?
While the Bank of Canada continues to do its job to drive down inflation, which is going down, we will continue to do our job to be there to support Canadians who need it, with investments in things like dental care, in a grocery rebate, in supports for low-income renters, and the kinds of things that Conservatives would be cutting instead. Canadians are hurting, and the Conservatives' answer is cuts to programs, cuts to supports for families, cuts to Canadians at a time they need it. Austerity is not the answer, Mr. Speaker. Responsible fiscal approach is. That's exactly what we're doing by supporting Canadians who need it.
You can add Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas to the list of Conservative politicians who are concerned about the second Trudeau carbon tax, which is now in effect. Thomas says our Prime Minister's policies have been consistently hurting Canadians.
I think it comes down to this. I think we have a Prime Minister who is much more interested in upholding his ideology than he is in listening to common sense. He's more in tune with himself and his goals than he is with the needs of Canadians. And I think, we're seeing that in a myriad of areas, but this is definitely one of them. Adding a second carbon tax is going to drive up the cost of living for Canadians. Based on an independent review that was done on it, it plus the first carbon tax, so both combined, are going to add an additional $4,000 per year in expenses to the average Canadian household.
Make sure you catch the full one-on-one interview with Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas and myself coming up after Business News. Bill C-18 is new legislation by the Trudeau government that could have a severe impact on news organizations such as ours when it comes to posting content online. The bill requires big tech companies like Meta and Google to pay for Canadian news content. Those same tech companies have said they're not going to, and instead they want to yank Canadian news from their platforms. Peter Menzies is the former vice chair of the CRTC, and he says those who support the legislation, including Senator Peter Harder, are sadly mistaken in thinking that Facebook and Google will pay for Canadian news.
One of the things that Canada's been very naive, and Senator Harder is among them about this. The Heritage Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, keeps saying, well, the whole world is watching Canada to see it. Do you really think Google and Meta are prepared to pay 30 to 35% of global journalism's cost? If that's your plan for the future of journalism, right, to go get money from somebody who right now has some and build that as your platform, that's absurd. You need to have something that's market driven so that the people who the system serves are readers, viewers, and listeners, and not big tech companies.
To fully understand the impact of Bill C-18, be sure to watch the full interview with Peter Menzies and myself coming up after Business News. Hundreds of striking port workers attended a solidarity rally near the Vancouver waterfront seeking a new contract with the BC Maritime Employers Association. Union President Rob Ashton says employers are waiting for Ottawa to do their dirty work and issue back-to-work legislation instead of negotiating to end the week-old strike at BC's ports.
when we put a proposal on the table to get the deal done and get us into monetary, because we knew that was the path forward to protect our workers' way of life, not only for our generation, but for future generations. Because that's our responsibility. And what did the employer do? They tucked tail and ran. Because you see, they don't want to negotiate with us. They don't want to do the right thing for the workers of the Longshore Division that put their lives on the line during the COVID pandemic. When everybody else was told to stay home, we had to go to work. And we went to work because we had to, because it was our responsibility to keep goods flowing.
The Employers Association is calling for binding arbitration to end the strike involving around 7,400 workers at more than 30 ports. The town of Taber has announced the dates and deadlines for its upcoming by-election. The seat was made available following the announcement that Councillor Alf Rudd was resigning. Officials say the nomination period is open now until August the 10th. Interested candidates can submit their nomination papers to the returning officer. Nomination day is August the 10th from 10 a.m. till noon. Voting day will be on September the 8th, with the polls closing at 8 p.m. To help locals in Lethbridge keep cool this summer, the city has installed 4 new drinking water stations as part of a new pilot project. The stations can be found on the west side at Nicholas Sharon Park, Legacy Park, Henderson Lake Park, and at Galt Gardens downtown. City officials say the cost was around $15,000, and the stations were designed and manufactured by staff at the city's water treatment plant. The pilot program will be reviewed by council at the end of the summer and potentially be brought back again next year. A recent fundraiser called Rita's Run has collected $25,000 for the Canadian Mental Health Association's Lethbridge chapter. The event paid tribute to Rita Jardetti, a woman who lost her battle with mental illness. Sandra Asachuk, the organizer of the run and sister of Jardetti, says she was blown away by the generosity of our community.
The generosity of the people of Lethbridge never ceases to amaze me. From an individual person to an organization to a small business to a huge corporation, we had so many people offer their help, from sponsoring the refreshments to helping out with just other costs and people volunteering their time as well. It is unbelievable how generous everybody from Lethbridge is and has always been.
The funds will be used to support programs and services for those battling mental health issues at the CMHA here in Lethbridge. Members of local organizations were on hand to announce the opening of the first Hascap Berry Winery in southern Alberta. Members of the Lethbridge media got a sneak peek of the Little Gem Winery on Friday morning. Joel Mance, the owner of the winery, talked a little bit about these special berries which help make the wine so very tasty.
Hascap berries is a fruit that's oblong in shape, the color of a blueberry, but from anywhere from 3 to 5 times higher antioxidants than blueberries. So they're classified as superfruit in Canada. They originate from Russia and Japan. And with that, we started growing. This is now what can we do with the product. So that's where Little Gem Winery was born. So we started applying that 5 years ago. And 3 years ago, we started making our first wines. And here we are today with the grand opening of our tasting rooms. That's kind of the final step into launching so people can come enjoy some wines, have some local Dutch foods, have a tour of the winery, and at certain times of the year, tours of the orchard.
Trevor Lewington, the CEO of Economic Development Lethbridge, discussed how this new winery will really help benefit the local economy.
Southern Alberta, Canada's premier food corridor. We have about 65 specialty crops in our region, so Hascap berries is one of them. Many people have never seen this oversized superfood. It looks like a big blueberry, basically. It's pretty tasty. But yeah, to actually make wine from it, I think is exciting for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, Hascap berry growers now have another use for their product. There's another thing that we can do with it, which gives them more options, hopefully adds more value beyond the sort of the basic crop itself. And the second component is it's pretty exciting to see actually wine being made in southern Alberta. There aren't any vineyards that I'm aware of. Winemaking is not, other than the homebrew sort of self-kit kind of thing, there's not a commercial operation like this anywhere in our region. So this is an entirely new industry, an entirely new opportunity, and it'll be interesting to see how they can grow it and who else might be able to enter into that same space.
Now, according to Stats Canada, wine sales have actually decreased by 4% to 516 million litres in 2021-2022. That's the equivalent of 2.4 standard glasses of wine per week per person. The City of Medicine Hat is set to welcome over 500 of the best pickleball players from across Western Canada and the Yukon this weekend at the Big Marble Go Centre's pickleball courts. The 2023 Western Canada Regional Pickleball Championship will feature men's and women's games along with younger kids taking up a paddle. BCN's Micah Quinn has that story.
Marco Jansen, a member of the tournament committee, told us all about the ins and outs of pickleball.
Pickleball is a sport that combines aspects of tennis, badminton, and ping pong. I actually sometimes make the comment that it's like ping pong, but on a life-size table. The court very commonly is played doubles, although singles do play. You play with a hard paddle and what looks like a wiffle ball, although it is specifically designed for pickleball. What we find is tennis players especially really like the game because although at a high level it can still be played very quickly, it is somewhat slower than tennis. So it's a hard ball, it's a hard racket, or a hard paddle, I should say. It's not a strung racket. And if you watch ping pong and watch pickleball, it's going to look very, very similar.
Jensen says pickleball isn't just for seniors, as younger kids and adults have also taken up the sport.
Pickleball was very, in its early stages, considered a seniors game because it was developed by older people. Now, when you look across North America, it is by far the absolute fastest growing sport in North America. It's being played at a very high level. There are regional championships, there are national championships, there are professional leagues starting up in Canada. In fact, we have some of the professional players here at our tournament this weekend.
For more information on the pickleball tournament, you can visit the Medicine Hat Pickleball Club Facebook page. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Looks like a lot of fun. May have to try that. A popular film is seen at theaters, including the Movie Mill here in Lethbridge. It is called The Sound of Freedom. It is produced by Angel Studios, the same production company which brought us the film Chosen. Now, it's a movie starring Jim Caviezel and Mira Sorvino based on the life of Tim Ballard. He's a former government agent who embarks on a mission to rescue children from sex traffickers in Colombia. Now, to discuss the film in more detail is the owner of the Movie Mill, Len Binning, who joins us here in Lethbridge. Len, how popular has the film been so far?
It has been an unbelievable response for a movie that up until probably a week ago, the world really had not heard of. The crowds are coming out in numbers. We're having sellouts on a daily basis. We've had to schedule a few extra performances, and the reaction has just been over the top. People are referring and calling their friends, and they're coming multiple times. It's a very powerful film.
Now, the movie is only at the Movie Mill for a limited time. Why is that, and for how long?
Well, they initially were planning on a 1-week release. I don't think they quite realized the impact the film would have. And we've just received word yesterday that we're able to extend the runtime. So hopefully we're going to have it here for a couple of weeks. I mean, I would still encourage getting in this first week to 10 days, because I think that's when for sure we have it. But I think everybody's been blown away by the success. In fact, it beat Indiana Jones on July 4th. Indiana Jones pulled in about $10 million. The Sound of Freedom pulled in $14 million. And it's not even playing in very many Canadian theaters. This is mostly a U.S. rollout.
Wow. You know, what's interesting about this movie is that Tim Ballard asked that Jim Caviezel portray him, even though he looks nothing like him. Caviezel has stated that The Sound of Freedom was the second most popular film he's ever done, next to The Passion of Christ. Now, do you feel that people today are looking for more movies with powerful messages that are oftentimes based on true stories?
I think they love true stories. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a place for superheroes and everything else, but that can't be every film that comes out of Hollywood. People like substance. They like to be moved. They might like to be emotionally engaged. And this is a film that ticks all those boxes. I won't kid you, though. It's a difficult watch. I mean, if you have children, if you let your mind stray too far, it will emotionally hurt you. But it's done well. In the U.S., it's only a PG-13. It did get a 14A here in Alberta, but it does not cross any lines. It lets your imagination take care of things, but I think it's handled very, very well.
Thanks so much, Len. Looking forward to seeing it. That was Len Binning, owner of the Movie Mill here in Lethbridge, discussing the popularity of the film Sound of Freedom, which is now in theaters for a limited time. Well, it was sunny and hot again today in southwestern Alberta. More of the same is on the way, just in time for the weekend. A full look at the weather pictures coming up. You know, if you don't have air conditioning in Lethbridge, it was a good day to maybe go shopping in a nicely air-conditioned mall, or maybe even do a little bit of window shopping as you feel the cool breeze inside. Angela Stewart is here now with a full look at the weather forecast. Angela, those hot temperatures will remain with us well into the weekend?
Yeah, absolutely. It's looking great ahead for the weekend as far as temperatures are concerned. Tomorrow is kind of where we could see an afternoon thunderstorm. There's about a 30% chance expected for tomorrow. Like I said, shooting up to 31 degrees there, 31 degrees for our high tomorrow. Risk of an afternoon thunderstorm. Sunday, beautiful, 31 degrees there, lots of sunshine. And then heading back into the work week, partly cloudy conditions for Monday, and then cooling off midweek Tuesday, Wednesday, 26, 24, and then 25 on Thursday. Our average high for this time of year is 25 degrees, so we actually beat that average. Our average low is 10. 34 degrees was the highest temperature recorded back on this day in 1943. Lowest temperature was 3 degrees back in 1996. Our sun rose at 5:32 this morning, expected to set at 9:40, so that'll put us at about 16 hours and exactly 8 minutes of daylight. So for temperatures across the country for Saturday now, winds gusting up to 60 at times near the Wanapeka Strait, near the water in Victoria, 24 degrees in Vancouver. Edmonton, 28. There's also a risk of an afternoon thunderstorm there. Calgary, about a 30% chance of an afternoon thunderstorm as well, but if they are able to sneak past the rain, it'll be a great day for Stampede if you are heading out there. Saskatchewan, 28. Saskatoon. Regina could see an afternoon thunderstorm there, but otherwise those high 20s are expected for a majority of Saskatchewan tomorrow. Rest of the prairies in Winnipeg, 25 degrees there, lots of sunshine. Going to be feeling quite humid. Now, as I mentioned in our cast yesterday, a majority of central Canada was under a heat warning, but Toronto has managed to sneak out of that heat warning. Otherwise, Ottawa and Montreal are the only two regions that still remain under that heat warning, so reminder to keep those tips if you are going to be heading out. 28, 27, and 27 for Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto tomorrow. Atlantic Canada, St. John's is the only place that is not under a heat warning. Otherwise, the rest of these cities, Fredericton, Halifax, and Charlottetown, are under that heat warning. So those tips, like I mentioned, lots of water, lots of sunscreen, take lots of breaks if you can. If you are out, wear loose-fitting clothing as best as you can. 28, 29, 28 for Fredericton, Halifax, Charlottetown, and 21. Some afternoon showers are expected in St. John's. And that is a look at your full weather details.
With solid gains in the job market, economists are expecting the Bank of Canada to raise its prime lending rate yet again next week. Stats Canada is reporting that the economy added 60,000 jobs last month, driven by gains in full-time work. As for those searching for work, the jobless rate climbed to 5.4%, which is the highest it's been in a year. Experts say the reason the unemployment rate can rise alongside historically strong employment growth is that the population growth continues to set new records, including an increase of 84,000 people in June. The BC Maritime Employers Association says the strike at the province's ports is causing layoffs in related industries. The labor dispute is now in its 7th day, and the group is calling on the International Longshore and Warehouse Union to enter a voluntary arbitration process to end the strike. The union says the Employers Association has launched a smear campaign against their own workers to try and break the strike. The union's president says the employers are refusing to share massive profits with workers while exaggerating dock workers' earnings and being silent on bonuses and salaries of executives. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 20 points on the day to finish at 19,831. The Dow was down 187 points to 33,734. The S&P 500 was down 12 on the day to 4398, and the Nasdaq was down 18 points to 13,660. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up $1.89 to $73.69 U.S. per barrel. Natural gas was down 4 cents to $2.57 U.S. Gold was up $14.31 on the day to $19.2522 U.S. an ounce, and silver was up 36 cents to $23.08 U.S. an ounce. Feed wheat is at $11.02 per bushel, barley's at $9.04, canola's at $16.95, and corn is at $9.91 per bushel. Live cattle August contract was up $2.43 to $177. Feeder cattle August contract was up $3.15 to $245.43, and lean hogs were down $1.05 to $99. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to 75.32 US. Recapping one of our top stories, tens of thousands of people came out and lined the streets of downtown Calgary, taking in the Stampede Parade today. There were lots of floats, classic cars, entertainers, horses, lots of horses, along with cowboys and cowgirls. The Calgary Stampede runs now until July 16th, featuring a midway, lots of games, food, concerts, and of course the legendary rodeo, which has a purse of around $1.85 million this year. You know, there's been a lot of talk about how potentially damaging the federal government's Bill C-18 could be to news organizations, including us right here at Bridge City News. A former vice chair of the CRTC, Peter Menzies, will join us in a moment with the details. Listen, if you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You've probably heard a lot about Bill C-18 coming down from the Trudeau Liberals, Bill C-11, or the term online censorship in the last few years. Controversial legislation that is poised to be in the name of preserving Canadian content and sustaining a valuable industry. Many experts feel, however, that the way the Trudeau government has handled this crosses the line. Now, with me to talk more about some of these bills is Peter Menzies, formerly of the CRTC and an award-winning journalist. Peter joins us now from Calgary. Welcome to Bridge City News, Peter.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you.
Thanks so much. Now, as the former vice chair of the CRTC, let's get your thoughts firstly on Bill C-18 and the federal government announcing that it's going to pull ads from Facebook and Instagram in retaliation to Meta yanking Canadian news content because they refuse to pay news organizations for that content.
Well, it's as much a political move as anything else. It doesn't really have any economic impact on companies like Meta and Google, or they haven't pulled from Google yet, but for Meta, it amounts to $11 million a year in federal government spending. Meta itself is already spending $18 to $20 million directly supporting news organizations. So if it's withdrawing from the news business, it's going to withdraw from that funding too. So Meta's still ahead in terms of that. But I guess it's a gesture, a trying to look tough gesture. I find it a little puzzling. The Prime Minister was talking about, you know, Canada being under attack and that sort of stuff. It's just business, and it's just a business decision.
Why doesn't the government just kind of stay out of that business, stay out of our business? Essentially, we've got these platforms like Facebook and Instagram where we want to post our content. In exchange, you know, we give them the content, so it's a win-win scenario here. Is because potentially the government's thinking that a lot of these mega tech companies are making too much money on the backs of journalists?
That's the argument they're making, although nobody's really made the argument. People just say it. You know, it started with some publishers saying and some public officials repeating, you know, Facebook is stealing our content and making money on it. This was used by Rupert Murdoch in Australia. That sort of stuff. Nobody ever described exactly how they were stealing it. Nobody ever took them to court. Nobody ever called the cops. Nobody ever checked with the Competition Bureau. Nobody, you know, filed a intellectual property suit or anything like that. They just said it and expected it to stick, figuring these guys, well, they'll, rather than take the bad publicity, they'll pay up. But as it turns out, news isn't very valuable to Meta on Facebook or Instagram. At least that's their argument, and it's worth believing them because they've been backing out of it. And Facebook isn't necessarily a news place anyway. But anyway, that's kind of where it's left in terms of that. The government's had to do something, so it came up with this canceling advertising. The Liberal Party hasn't canceled its advertising. The NDP haven't canceled their advertising. So it's a gesture, and I'm kind of surprised that that's all they've got.
Let's talk more about C-18 itself and how this bill might impact the regulation and availability of local news in Canada online. I mean, if Meta ends up canceling the Bridge City News Facebook page, we've got over 44,000 followers there, and we're going to take a big hit.
Yes, you are. And you're going to have to figure out a new way to attract viewers and listeners. to your product in terms of advertising it, because what you've had for quite some time is free exposure to millions of eyeballs. In terms of that, that's what Facebook has provided. I mean, Facebook obviously makes a lot of money. They didn't make any money at all for the first few years, but they were building up the capacity to make a lot of money because they run advertising next to it. But they direct traffic to your website, where people are exposed presumably to your advertising and to your product. And so it's for free. You get to spread the word. So backing away from that is really going to hurt, particularly new and entrepreneurial companies. The older established ones, yeah, it'll hurt them too. Philip Crawley of the Globe and Mail at the Senate hearing said it would cost many, the cost just for his publication alone would be many millions of dollars.
So what's your reaction been like to the response from companies like Meta and Google talking about yanking a lot of the Canadian content?
Well, for Meta, like I said, it's really a pure business decision. They say that they only have about 3% of their traffic involves news, and that traffic is replicable, i.e., in other words, people will still. It's not like they will stop going to their Facebook page because there's no more news on there anymore. It'll probably be a bit of a glitch for them in terms of that. So my reaction with Meta is I'm not surprised at all. They've been saying really for about a year and a half that as Bill C-18 was constructed, they wouldn't have any choice other than to do this. In exchange, they got humiliated and belittled at Senate hearings and House of Commons committee hearings. They weren't even invited to the initial one. The government didn't even want to hear their point of view. So there's no surprise there at all. Google's a little bit more complicated because a search engine is much different than a social media platform. But in Google's case, I am actually surprised that they went as quickly out the gate as they did. They didn't want to. I'm aware of that. They tried to get something from the government. They couldn't get it. They thought they might get it. But I think it's probably a legal issue that if they're going to say they are going to be out, they need to say it earlier rather than later so they don't look as if they're retaliating to a negative decision down the road, which is what they're looking to be, is exempted.
Peter, let's get your views on Bell Media's request to no longer carry local news as a requirement for funding. What are the potential implications of that request on the Canadian news landscape? What are your thoughts?
Well, it depends how they play it out. I mean, they say that this is going to give them the flexibility they need to do this and do that and that sort of stuff. We've heard that argument and certainly heard it a lot at the CRTC over the years. If you lessen our obligations, things will get better. There isn't actually a lot of evidence to support the idea that it will get better. Alberta used to have, for CTV, for instance, and most other provinces did, their own general manager, in major areas, in major markets, and for the region. A lot of breakfast shows and that sort of stuff. Certainly for other companies, I can't say for sure about CTV, but I believe it's the case. Their producers are based in Toronto. You get less and less local all the time. So the problem with that is that it's transactional. If you want the government to license you through the CRTC to have a broadcast license, there are a certain set of expectations that are put upon you in order to do that. And one of them has always been the provision of news. So if you don't want to get to do the news anymore, if you don't want to carry that obligation, then which one of your rights are you willing to give up? Are you willing to give up the right to have must carry status on cable? And that sort of stuff. So I find that rather frustrating, and I think Bell's done a very poor job of explaining it. If they have a good reason for it, I don't know. Bell's a big company, right? It makes $10 billion a year. Yes, Facebook and Google are bigger, but if the government can go after them for money, Bell can certainly afford to continue to support local news in its markets.
Let's talk a little bit more about local news. I know a lot of our viewers from across the country, that watch us on Bridge City News appreciate the national perspective we bring, the provincial, and here in southwestern Alberta, a lot of the local stories that our reporters cover. In your opinion, what role does local news really play in serving communities and fostering that civic engagement?
There's an old phrase used by a philosopher, early 20th century philosopher, G.K. Chesterton, that said, only what is local is real. In terms of people. And I spent 30 years in the newspaper business, and it was being able to take the news and it make sense to people. Politicians, when they go door knocking, what do they hear about? They hear about garbage pickup. They hear about who's the neighbor's backyard. They hear about cat bylaws. They hear about
snow removal.
Snow removal. Snow removal is huge, right? They hear about things that affect people's everyday lives. So when you disconnect them like that, when they can only go, I mean, certainly you can go to the city website. I mean, you go to the Lethbridge city website, you go to the Calgary city, where you want, and get information there. But it's not the same, because information isn't brought to you. You have to go to the information.
Considering the changing media landscape and the rise of digital platforms, what measures should be taken to really ensure the sustainability of local news outlets? Is it more maybe promoting our own websites and driving a lot of people to our content there?
Well, I think what you have to do, sometimes the government always wants to help, right? And they don't always help when they get involved, because they don't understand the business in terms of its history. So sometimes it's just get out of the way. Now, I mean, I recently published a paper with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute through a former chairman of the CRTC, Conrad von Finkenstein. And what we presented was that there's a really need for a national news industry policy of some kind that recognizes all these things and puts these things together and provides the incentives in the right place for viewers and listeners and readers, as well as for companies, and clears clutter out and understands the revolution that's taking place right now. It is huge. It's significant. The technology revolution, it has changed the way we communicate and interact with each other. And we need a broad public policy framework. It could include a fund, that we've suggested it should. We need the CBC to be reformed a lot. It shouldn't be carrying advertising at all. We should be able to provide 100% tax deductible subscriptions to newspapers or other services, news services provided, and on and on and on. So no single thing's going to fix it, but some sort of intelligent consultation that understands what's going on and builds a path forward, and doesn't just try to subsidize failed business models of the past.
Now, one of the supporters of Bill C-18 is Senator Peter Harder. He expressed that the government expects Google and Meta to pay as much as 30 to 35% of the news expenditures of Canadian news outlets as a result of this legislation. What are your thoughts?
Exactly. I mean, it's actually absurd if he thinks that's going to happen, because one of the things that Canada's been very naive, and Senator Harder is among them about this. I mean, the Heritage Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, keeps saying, well, the whole world is watching Canada to see it. Do you really think Google and Meta are prepared to pay 30 to 35% of global journalism's cost? Because whatever happens in Canada is going to be replicated someplace else. People will say, oh, look what Canada did. They got 30, 35% of journalism paid for in terms of that. Let's do it too. So New Zealand does it. Australia goes back at it and does it again. India does it. It just goes on and on, and the cost just becomes enormous. It's just not sustainable. And if that's your plan for the future of journalism, right, to go get money from somebody who right now has some, and build that as your platform, that's absurd. You need to have something that's market driven, so that the people who the system serves are readers, viewers, and listeners, and not big tech companies.
Peter, let's get your opinion on Bill C-11, or as some Alberta politicians refer to it as the online censorship bill. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, what it does is it takes the world of the CRTC, that broadcast world, that very, very heavily regulated world. It's so complex. I mean, just go to the CRTC's website. I dare you, and try to find your way through to expressing your opinion on one of the matters involving C-11 that's before the CRTC right now. It is it is virtual barbed wire to try to get through there and make your voice heard as a consumer, let alone as a direct stakeholder. I think it's an enormous mistake. I think if they wanted bigger to guarantee more contributions, and certainly the contributions in French products seem to be a driving factor behind this, just tax them and send the money where you want to send it. There is no need to regulate all of us and attempt to regulate the global internet in order to achieve that goal. And I think at the end of the day, there's going to be no more money for the people who think there's going to be a lot of money. There'll be a higher percentage of it for French product than there is right now. That'll happen for sure. But a lot of those YouTuber channels and others, the regulatory burden that's going to be put upon them. I mean, if I was operating, I don't know, a TV operation out of Lethbridge, I'd think about going to Whitefish, Montana, and starting it up there.
Well, they do have some beautiful lakes down there, that's for sure.
And they do, and good skiing and yeah, Canadian at Park quite often too. So.
Peter Menzies is a national newspaper award-winning journalist and former vice chair of the CRTC. Thanks so much for joining us today from Calgary.
Hey, I appreciate your interest, and hopefully I was helpful.
A number of Canadians are still struggling to pay their mortgages, their rent, struggling at the pumps, and struggling to put food on their tables. Visits to food banks across Canada are at all-time highs. Now, to talk about a lot of the struggles Canadians and Albertans are facing right now is Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas. She joins us from our nation's capital in Ottawa. Now, Rachel, the Trudeau government's second carbon tax is also kicking us. Well, we're down right now. I mean, it's not making life any easier for so many of us. Why isn't the message getting across to our Prime Minister that Canadians really need a break right now?
Yeah, Hal, I think it's an excellent question, and certainly one that I'm hearing a lot about from constituents. I think it comes down to this. I think we have a Prime Minister who is much more interested in upholding his ideology than he is in listening to common sense. He's more in tune with himself and his goals than he is with the needs of Canadians. And I think, we're seeing that in a myriad of areas, but this is definitely one of them. Adding a second carbon tax is going to drive up the cost of living for Canadians. Based on an independent review that was done on it, it plus the first carbon tax, so both combined, are going to add an additional $4,000 per year in expenses to the average Canadian household, which is a significant amount of cost, as you can imagine. Just even in my office, I've had individuals come in who are telling me they're having to make choices between putting food on their table versus paying for medication versus being able to pay their home heating bill. I think there's this feeling of desperation and a bit of hopelessness, and people just feeling disempowered by the massive skyrocketing cost of living that they're experiencing and just the overall challenges that are hitting them at the moment.
Rachel, let's talk about Bill C-18 for just a moment here. It passed through the Senate, received royal assent, and it'll put the state squarely in the newsroom of our country, including here at Bridge City News. And many people argue that it hinders journalistic independence while removing choices from Canadians. Can you explain why?
Sure. So at the heart of Bill C-18 is this idea that news outlets would be able to enter into negotiations with platforms such as Facebook and Google. And out of those negotiations, Facebook and Google would then compensate news sources for the links that are put online and made available to the public. But the problem with this is of course, that then, first off, the CRTC, which is directed by the government, will have to determine which news sources are eligible to enter into these negotiations and which ones aren't. So essentially, it's, some outlets will get a state stamp of approval and then other outlets will not get the state stamp of approval. So you're putting the government squarely in the newsroom. And then the other thing that's happening here is you're putting tech giants also in the newsroom. So tech giants will enter into negotiations with these news outlets. And of course, those tech giants will have demands as well. So they'll want certain types of news to be produced or certain stories told or certain angles taken. And in order for these negotiations to be upheld, those demands will have to be met. which means then really at the end of the day, you don't have independent media anymore. You then have state-directed media and media, directed by big tech companies, which of course poses massive problems for Canadians because they want to be able to trust the stories that they're being told. But when the newsroom is being directed by government and big tech giants, just how truthful is it, and how much can those stories really be trusted? And so there's just huge implications in terms of journalistic independence, and of course, to what extent Canadians can trust the stories that are being communicated to them.
We've even seen censorship as well regarding some of the interviews we do when it comes to COVID-19 vaccine injuries. We put it on our YouTube channel, ban. We got slapped with a ban. We're off of YouTube for a week. I'm like, what? What's going on here, right? Yeah, it's one strike against you. So we have to end up using platforms like Rumble, and BitChute and some of the other ones as well. Now, Rachel, we recently celebrated National Indigenous Peoples Day, yet so many First Nations people we chat with say in order to really work towards reconciliation, we need to do a better job of providing clean drinking water in so many First Nations communities here in our country. Why are we failing in that regard?
Yeah. Oh, man. It's such an important question because, again, I think we see the Prime Minister and his government, speaking according to ideology, but unfortunately their actions don't align. And so on the one side, he'll say that there's no greater relationship or no relationship more important than that than the relationship with Indigenous folks. And then at the same time, though, there's this incredible neglect that's taking place with regards to just providing these basic necessities of life. I mean, in many areas, it is easier to access government-sanctioned safe supply drugs than it is clean drinking water. In what world does that make sense? I mean, that is certainly not the Canada that most people I speak to want to live in. That is not the reality we want to call home. And certainly when I speak with Indigenous leaders in our area, that is not what they want either. They want their people to live in safe communities. They want their people to have access to the basic necessities of life. They do not want the government to facilitate easier access to drugs. And so really, I think we're looking at a government that has its priorities all wrong.
Now, your leader, Pierre Poilievre, says he's ready to work with other parties to help launch an independent, nonpartisan public inquiry into Beijing's interference with our federal elections. How's that coming along?
Yeah, so I mean, this has been quite the story. It's certainly been unfolding for the last 6 months or so. And that is, of course, with regard to Beijing interfering in Canada's elections, both in 2019 and 2021. There is substantial evidence of this nature. Recently we heard from the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. Her name is Katie Telford. She came to committee a couple of months ago and she testified that the Prime Minister receives everything. Nothing is withheld. And the second statement she made is that the Prime Minister reads everything. Nothing is ignored. So if he receives everything and he reads everything, then there's just simply no way that he wasn't aware of election interference. And so that being the case, we can only conclude that he has been misleading Canadians and trying to cover up, which means that ultimately Canadians deserve a public inquiry. They deserve a neutral third party to investigate this and to get to the bottom of it. And the reason why this is so important is because ultimately we're a democratic country and we depend on free and fair elections. And so if there's a foreign actor that is interfering, then Canadians deserve to know that and the impact that has had. That said, I think there's certainly evidence to suggest that the Liberals don't want this. We know based on testimony that they benefited significantly from this interference, that it's partially responsible for keeping them in power. And so I understand why they're hesitant to do what Canadians are asking. But at the end of the day, as government, they have a responsibility to make sure that they abide by the will of Canadians. The vast majority want an investigation completed. And so here we are, and we're waiting. As the Conservative Party of Canada, Mr. Poilievre has made it very clear that he is ready to go, and he's just simply waiting for the government to hit the big red button and say that they're going to do it. And then we're happy to play ball. And so we have suggestions in terms of what that study needs to look like in terms of reference. And also we have suggestions with regards to who those neutral third parties might be.
Rachel, how damning could this be for the Prime Minister, an inquiry like this? Or some people refer to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as the Teflon man because nothing really sticks to him.
Hal, I think Canadians are going to be the ones to determine the answer to that question. Ultimately, it's going to be up to them to hold him to account. And so it's my hope that Canadians have had enough. They've obviously watched as this Prime Minister has tried to skirt various issues throughout his time as leader of this country. They've watched as he has misled Canadians. He has tried to cover up, and he has multiple ethics breaches against his name. And so it's my hope that Canadians would see his conduct and that they would vote accordingly. And ultimately, I would make the argument that based on his behavior, based on his decisions, he does not deserve to be leader of this country. And in particular, with regards to the foreign interference, we have a prime minister who was aware of Beijing's interference both in the 2019 and 2021 elections and chose to turn a blind eye. Canadians, I think, are rightly concerned by that, and I think now is the time to choose a different path for our country, which means a different leader.
Are we any closer, though, to a federal election? Is NDP leader Jagmeet Singh any closer to pulling the plug on the coalition so Canadians will have the chance to maybe vote the Trudeau Liberals out, or is it just going to be status quo till 2025?
Again, a really great question, Hal. And fair enough, right? Unfortunately, the NDP has been very cozy with the Liberals and is responsible for holding them in power. We've had, multiple non-confidence votes come forward, and unfortunately, because the NDP have reinforced the Liberal Party, they've been able to maintain power, and therefore, Justin Trudeau remains our Prime Minister. Will that shift anytime soon? I guess I would. My observations would be that the coalition is quite cozy. That there doesn't seem to be too much of an indication of fracturing, and so I suppose we could be waiting until at least 2024, if not 2025, before we see an election.
Now, you said that it was outrageous that one of the worst serial killers in Canadian history was transferred from a maximum to a medium security prison under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's watch. Rachel, how did that happen?
Yeah, so basically, Mr. Mendocino is the Minister for Public Safety, and it's his responsibility to read the notifications that come across his desk and to either, sign off on them or halt them. In this case, unfortunately, it went forward that Mr. Bernardo was moved from a high security prison to a medium security prison. And this is, as you said, one of Canada's greatest serial killers, someone who certainly doesn't deserve to be in a medium security prison, but rather someone who should be kept in max security at all times for the remainder of his life. And really what that comes down to is the safety and security of Canadians and ultimately advocating for victims. Sadly, Mr. Mendocino chose to put the criminal ahead of the victims in this case. Mr. Mendocino now is enjoying greater comfort and greater leniency. Meanwhile, his victims are extremely fearful. And when I say victims, obviously he took the lives of his true victims, but he left families, he left parents, he left siblings, he left spouses to grieve the loss. And so when the minister made the decision to allow Mr. Bernardo to be removed from maximum security and placed in medium security, really, I think that's a slap in the face to these loved ones who have been left behind to try to process their grief. Ultimately, he has the opportunity to own this mistake and to reverse course. And so far, he's chosen instead to defend and deflect, to shift blame to his staff members, and ultimately to do nothing. And I think that's really sad.
A recent poll published in the National Post says Canadians of all stripes are simply fed up with the federal government's line on crime and drugs. It says every single demographic that people are really frustrated with Canada's justice system. They say it's far too generous with bail and too lenient on violent criminals. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, certainly. As you mentioned, the vast majority of Canadians believe that our laws are too lenient, that they are far more on the side of the criminal than they are on the side of the victims. That needs to change. And I think, again, this is where I would say this government is abiding by some messed up ideology rather than reality. In what world does it make sense to put Bill C-5 in place, which took place in 2021? Under this bill, the government decreased or became more lenient with regards to violent crime. So, for example, when committing robbery with a firearm, the repercussions for that were downgraded. In addition to that, someone who would kidnap and child traffic, the punishment for that got downgraded. The list goes on and on. There's these heinous crimes that the government determined were not needing to be punished nearly to the extent that they once were, and so they actually became more lenient. Well, now you have criminals who are walking our streets, committing these violent crimes, often in a repetitive nature, and the government is choosing to turn a blind eye. That's wrong. Most Canadians are turning on the news every night and seeing someone who, got on a city bus or was standing on a train platform or walking down the street or sipping coffee at a Starbucks. And Canadians are watching as these individuals are violently attacked on the news. That's an incredibly sad state. And it's the state that we've entered into because we have a government that has refused to put the security and the safety of Canadians in a place of primal importance. And I think that's atrocious.
Many Albertans are not happy with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Just Transition plan, having thousands in our energy sector transition out of oil and gas. You've been very vocal against that. Why would the federal government want to transition out of one of our country's most profitable industries?
Again, great question. So I think with regards to oil and gas sector, here's what we know. We know that, Justin Trudeau's Just Transition will result in about 170,000 direct job losses. So if you take the population of Lethbridge, 170,000 job losses is just about twice our population. So just wiped out, jobless. That's devastating, not only for the industry, not only for our overall economy, but most importantly, it's devastating for those households or those individuals who rely on that income. The second thing that I'll draw people's attention to is the fact that within oil and gas, this is the largest private sector investor when it comes to clean technology. And so make no mistake, this is an industry that is actually for the environment and abiding by the greatest or most stringent rules that exist in the world. And so this really is an industry that is doing us a whole lot of favor and actually not a lot of harm. And so I think we need to celebrate that and own that proudly as a country. And the last thing that I'll leave our audience with is this. This is the industry that also is responsible for pumping billions of dollars into the overall economy, hundreds of millions of dollars into local economies. And what this equates to then is it equates to new ice rinks, new community centers, new swimming pools, new hospitals, new schools. That is the overall result of a thriving energy sector. And so when the government goes after that industry and tries to drive it into the ground, we have to wonder about our future and just how vibrant it is going to be.
Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas, thanks so much for your time today and for joining us from Ottawa.
Thank you for having me. Great to be with you.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and thanks for watching.